I always have a snack. Anyway, I had some wheat thins there, and I thought, I wonder if there's any chance I could lure him closer and poke him with a jab stick. So I opened the window and I threw wheat thins out as far as I could. And pretty soon, he left the apples and started eating the wheat thins, so I made the trail closer and closer to the window. And then using the windowsill for a rest, and that's my jab stick there, I poked him in the neck and he snarl, snap, and went over and ate some more apples, went under the drug, and rolled down, of course, over the garden, over Holly's tomato plants. And here I was thinking I was going to be such a hero. It didn't quite work out that way. So anyway, I drug him. He's a pretty good sized bear. I drug him out of the garden back up by the cabin there for the photo op. So I think this is where I go to Holly.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we did with students with education programs. We had undergraduate students come in, and Jim and I ran several different programs for undergraduate students from the University of Idaho. And Taylor Ranch was just the perfect spot to do education. Students that came to Taylor Ranch were mostly in the wildlife or forestry type fields. And a lot of them didn't have a lot of hands-on experience. They had a lot of knowledge from going to classes, but coming to the wilderness was the opportunity to kind of pull together what they had learned in a classroom. And we often heard from students that they learned so much when they spent their summer at Taylor Ranch, and they thought, well, we're not really teaching them a whole lot. So it wasn't specifically what we taught them, but it was the opportunity for them to understand and integrate the pieces that they'd learned in school with actually being out and being in nature and understanding those concepts from the experience rather than just from learning from books. So we enjoyed engaging our students in some of the projects that we were involved in with some of the research we did, and also had programs for students to do their own studies. And these are some students from various years. The ones with the cougars were involved with a study that Jim and I were working on with wolves and cougars. And students, just like us, they enjoyed handling the animals, and so we always had lots of good adventures in the wilderness handling various animals that we were working on. We also did a lot of archaeology work, both in the 1980s as well as after 2000. You might think the wilderness is a remote place, and when we interviewed the students, when we selected them each year, we'd ask them questions like, well, how do you think you'll do living in a remote place where there aren't very many people? And they're like, oh yeah, I'd be fine at that. I'm a real loner. I like being by myself. And then we said, well, what do you think about intensively living with a group of people that you can't get away from, that you're with them 24/7? So it's a combination of being away from general society and, going out to the movies and being with your friends, but you're also stuck with a small group of people. And everybody really bonded well by and large. It was really a special time, and we did a lot of things together. And the students, we hear from most of our students to this day, and a lot of them have remained friends for life based on their experiences bonding at Taylor Ranch. Our main program we did with the undergraduate students was what we called the Wilderness Internship, and the students would shadow either me or Jim every day and work with us on whatever projects we were working on, or we'd have specific projects for them. Sometimes they would help other students. But just some examples here. On the left, they're setting up a remote camera to monitor bears. We put up hay with a mule team. We set up mist nets to catch bats. Top right, we're doing vegetation sampling on the bottom up at Chamberlain Basin. They learned how to use crosscut saws and traditional tools. Um, and then we did some invasive weed work where we were picking spotted knapweed and sampling areas that had invasive weeds in the wilderness. So a big variety of activities. And then these students all had their own project. We started this program when we came back in 1997. We decided that we needed to have the next level up of undergraduate programs and allow students to do almost like a thesis where they picked out their own research topic and came in and were responsible for that project. So for these students, we were there as advisors and mentors, but they were responsible for making this project work. And so we had some really gung-ho students that really learned a lot, and many of them went on to graduate school and had essentially already learned how to do research like a graduate student. Like I said, there were lots of opportunities to interact with wildlife. On the left is my friend Cheryl came to visit me one time, and we were checking out some wolf dens. So she's in a wolf den right now, right there, looking out. We had a student that did both undergraduate and graduate work on rattlesnakes. So we all got to handle a lot of rattlesnakes, and I was the winter rattlesnake radio telemetry boss, so I would go out and find them underground in the winter. So I'm still getting my name on all kinds of publications because I helped them in the winter, which is really funny because I don't know a whole lot about rattlesnakes, but I'm well written up in the professional scientific documents. And then on the left, top left, we had a student from Zimbabwe that worked with us one summer, and then he came back as an intern in the winter and helped us with some of our research projects as well as doing maintenance at Taylor Ranch. And the other is recollaring wheat thin. One of our student crews one year, we had a tough time trying to get a hold of him to take his collar off and put a new one on because the other one was, the battery was dying in the collar. Then we did research on wolves and cougars. When we came back in 1997 to Taylor Ranch, the wolves had just been released in the central Idaho wilderness, and although we didn't think they were going to be at Big Creek because that was 95 and 96 that they were released in the wilderness, by 1999 when we started this project, the wolves had moved into the Big Creek drainage, and the pack that used the area where we live was one of the very first packs to reproduce in Idaho. So Jim had been involved with cougar research in Oregon and also helped Gary Kohler with his work in the 80s on cougars. So we were interested to know what was going to happen. We already had these big predators, the cougars there. How would the wolves affect things? And so that was part of what we wanted to figure out with the wolves moving in. These are two wolves that we radio collared and captured right by Taylor Ranch. We used foothold traps to catch them. And the one on the right is actually, we trapped her right on Taylor Ranch property. We had a mule that died, and so we used the mule as our trapping site. And that was the first wolf that we caught. And then this other wolf on the left, you look down in the picture, Taylor Ranch is at the bottom of the hill there. So we had wolves quite close to Taylor Ranch and had a lot of interactions with them. There are several stories in the book about some of our wolf adventures. We would do the study on the wolves in the wintertime because we had all the students in the summer. So we would set up wall tent camps and stock them with food for us and food for our mules. And we were able to ride horses and mules up and down the trail, and then we would snowshoe into the higher country to track the wolves and cougars. We had radio collars on both of them. And then we also used a 100-year-old cabin. It was about 6 miles upstream from us for winter camp. One of the things that we looked at in conjunction with this study was how things had changed over time in the wilderness. You know, people talk about, oh, we need to have wilderness because we want to set it aside and we want to maintain the land in a certain way. Well, when you have wilderness, it doesn't maintain itself. It changes all the time. And so whether people influence or not, you know, it could be fires or all kinds of reasons why the landscape changes. So we looked at a variety of sources of information and put together this graph that showed that in 1800 there were primarily bighorn sheep in the Big Creek area and the central Idaho wilderness. Then deer increased as sheep decreased, and then elk became more common. And the data sets we used, though, to make this graph were historical documents. So in 1800, the data set that we used there was the archaeological excavation that was done at by Taylor Ranch by Frank Leonhardy, with the proportion of bones that were found in that archaeological dig that were primarily bighorn sheep bones and some mule deer bones. The 1900 data set was from a diary, 7 years of diary from some homesteaders that homesteaded 6 miles from Taylor Ranch. And every day in their diary they would write in there, shot 3 deer, heard a wolf howl, shot at an elk. And we wrote down everything that they said and added it all up to figure out what proportions they were killing, assuming they probably were killing pretty close to the proportions of animals that were out there. And then on up into the other years, there were some early Forest Service and Fish and Game winter surveys that were done in 1938 and 1951. Morris Hornocker's work in 1967, and then some Fish and Game data that's more recent. So we took a lot of different pieces of information to try to reconstruct, 200-year history. So it was a lot of fun to use the historical information. And 2000 was probably the biggest event that happened to us at Taylor Ranch. We had the Diamond Point fire come over Taylor Ranch, and the year 2000 was a year of a lot of fires in the central Idaho area, both in the wilderness and out. At the time this fire started, we went up on a mountaintop the day that we saw the start of this fire, and there were 6 big mushroom clouds from other fires burning in and around the wilderness. So this was one of the last ones to get started, but in the area right on the Crassell Ranger District and the adjacent district, 500,000 acres burned that summer. And this picture is taken from our pasture looking upstream. This fire is on the ridge that comes down. Taylor Ranch is down here in the bottom, and Jim and I are headed out with horses and mules and our dog fleeing the fire. Unfortunately, we went 21 miles and went to the Flying Bee Ranch on the middle fork of the Salmon River, and 4 days after we got there, the fire that was at Taylor Ranch came over, hit 2 other fires, burned together at the Flying Bee, and this is what happened at the Flying Bee. We had a major firestorm, bigger than what had hit Taylor Ranch, come over us at the Flying Bee Ranch. So I wrote a chapter about our fire story, and I wanted to read some of that to you. This is a picture that our student Chris McDaniel took at the Flying Bee while we were there when the fire hit the Flying Bee.
And that's 3 in the afternoon on a clear day.
As Jim said, that's 3 in the afternoon on a clear day. The sky was so full of clouds up above us it completely blocked out the sun. Ominous mushroom clouds of smoke developed that afternoon. To the northwest was the Short Creek fire. To the west was the Shell Rock fire. Our brush clearing crew turned on the sprinklers and we began hosing down cabins. The Middle Fork lookout radioed the Flying Bee to report that the Shell Rock fire was 6 miles away from us and coming our way rapidly. He He called it a fire of biblical proportions. The sky to the west turned orange. The time had come to initiate our firefighting plan. Our fire crew, made up of 2 Forest Service firefighters, 10 Flying Bee and Root Ranch employees, and 3 of us from University of Idaho, took our positions. I was responsible for the safety of the women who would not be able to run from the fire. Vicki grabbed a few jugs of water and got her 3 dogs. Hope brought her dog, and I loaded up some tarps. The 3 of us squeezed into the truck with the dogs. There was a truck that they had helicoptered in to the Flying Bee. This is another backcountry ranch that was used for hunting. So it had a vehicle, but they only drove like from the ranch to the airstrip a half a mile away. I tried to drive slowly the half mile to the field that was our safety zone, but my heart was pounding. The flames of the Short Creek fire rippled and danced on the long ridge line to the northwest. To the southwest, angry smoke clouds from the Shell Rock fire crowded the sky. I parked the truck in the center of the field, the lush alfalfa field facing the fires. This would be fascinating to watch, I thought. Within 10 minutes, flames were on the hillsides just beyond the fence line. We quickly got out of the truck. With dogs and gear, we moved as far from the truck as possible, 20 yards from the middle fork, in case we needed to get into the river. We watered down our tarps and sat down. The 55 head of Flying Bee horses and mules shared the pasture with us. Alarmed by the flames, they galloped around. I jumped up and spooked them from our area so we wouldn't be trampled. We pulled the tarps over ourselves and huddled under them. Meanwhile, at Doug's recommendation, Jim and Chris lit drip torches for backburning behind the corral. Rick, Mike, Scott, and John manned the fire hose stations. The freight train sound that we had heard at Taylor Ranch was louder than what we had heard when we left Taylor Ranch, and the sky overhead turned from orange to black. Rick asked Jim if our stock was in a safe place, and Jim was reminded he had not cut an opening in the fence to allow the mules to escape. So we ran back to the pasture and cut the fence by the middle fork of the Salmon River. Cricket, our smartest mule, watched Jim cut the barbed wire. Just as she stepped through the opening, the wind ripped a section of metal roofing from the barn with a screeching sound. It spooked the animals and they galloped away. Cricket sprinted after them and they disappeared into the darkness. It was 4 p.m. I think I have a picture of that. There's 4 p.m. It was completely dark, and the only reason I'm smiling is because I had taken pictures of the other women and then I wanted them to take one of me, and they were like, well, where are you? We couldn't see anything, so we could only see from the flash of the camera. Jim saw embers ignite the hay in the pole barn and ran to help Ron and Joanne throw buckets of water on the stack, but it was futile. The barn was instantly an inferno. Jim ran to the shop to leash our dog Micah and Rick's dog and get them to the river. He turned the doorknob and pushed against the door, but it wouldn't open. The fire-caused winds had created a negative pressure inside the shop. Rick and Scott arrived and they helped force the door open. By now there was no way to get to the river, and as they ducked inside, the wind's intensity increased. Debris pelted the shop, and it sounded like a hurricane. All they could do was stay put. When the wind subsided, Jim, Rick, and Scott stepped outside to find that the woodshed, filled with 15 cords of firewood, was on fire. All that remained of the roof was a tangled heap of metal on the ground. Nearby, a propane shed had collapsed and scattered 12 propane tanks like bowling pins. The firestorm wind hit the suspension bridge that spanned the middle fork of the Salmon River, yanking it from the slots in the footing, straining its giant eye bolts, and whipping the bridge into the air like a sheet on a clothesline. Decking lumber flew into the air. When the wind released its grip, the bridge slammed down, buckling its 12-inch I-beams into a W like an accordion. We estimated the wind could have been 100 miles per hour. Joanne and Marion were under the bridge when it buckled, but they drifted down the river to safety. Their eyelids were burned by the scorching heat from shrubs that had ignited along the riverbank. At the same time, fire engulfed the grassy hillsides around our hayfield and burned to the fence line. A hot blast of wind from the south flattened Vicky, Hope, and me to the ground as the Short Creek and Shell Rock fires merged, then roared up the east side of the Middle Fork. As the firestorm burned all around us, the giant smoke cloud blocked out the sun. It was afternoon, but completely dark except for orange flames that glowed in all directions. Our silhouettes were backlit by fire, but we couldn't make out each other's faces. This is the picture of a bridge that got buckled like an accordion from the winds of the fire. And this is the cabin that they gave us to stay in after we fled Taylor Ranch from fire. I was mesmerized watching the fires burning on the hillsides around us and blazing along the river. But as the sky began to lighten, I looked toward the Flying Bee. A large orange aura emanated from the Flying Bee compound, shooting light high into the sky. Alarmed, I thought of Jim. Was he all right? Could anyone have survived the fire that created that radiating glow? And the rest is in the book. So this was our firefighting crew. We're not exactly trained firefighters, and everyone that was there had the chance to fly out the day before this fire hit. And there was, most of us wanted to stay. Of course, we really didn't think it was going to be quite as bad as it was. There was one person that was wanting to leave originally, but once we developed a escape plan and a firefighting plan, she said, okay, I'll stay. So that was our crew. This is what it looked like in the areas that had been brushy and beautiful along the streams. When we left Taylor Ranch, when we knew we had to flee the fire, we still had a lot of questions like, well, should we go down into the shrubs along the stream? Well, that's what they look like. That would have been a bad idea. Should we go up into the bunch grass hillsides that hardly had any vegetation? Well, they were totally burned. There was nowhere really that you could escape from the fire. Even the pasture that we had irrigated at Taylor Ranch, the heat must have been quite hot from the fire after we left, because all the horse manure in the pasture was ash, even though the grass was still green. So it was very interesting. We decided to leave because we didn't know the answers to can we survive at Taylor Ranch with this fire. This was the trail back to Taylor Ranch. I ended up flying out from the Flying Bee because our dog got injured, not related to the fire. And so Jim came back with our student helper, Chris, and that was what the trail looked like that they encountered. This is our cabin, the Taylor cabin at Taylor Ranch. You can see how close the fire came to burning it, burned the hillside all the way within 15 feet of the fire. As it turns out, we didn't know if the Forest Service would be able to get in to help fight the fire. We had to leave no matter what, and they couldn't get in the day that the fire was right there at Taylor. But they got in about 2 hours after we left, and we're certain if they had not gotten in, we would have lost most of the buildings at Taylor Ranch. So we were really relieved that they were able to save our buildings. We were able to help the Flying Bee save many of their buildings. But it was a marginal situation as far as survival. There was a third fire a couple weeks later, further up the Middle Fork at the Pistol Creek. And at that point, the Forest Service and the Sheriff's Office said, nobody's going to stay anymore in these fires. So they had to leave, and they lost 20 out of 29 buildings because nobody was able to be there to help protect them. Back to Jim.
Okay.
back to me. I must have survived. Well, sometimes it doesn't feel like it. So anyway, back on this theme, maybe I'm talking about the theme, old Idaho, new Idaho. We were kind of a classic example, I think, particularly after the fire. We needed to build that new structure, and we opted to fly in a backhoe, and that was pretty handy to have. Mules are strong pullers, but they're not very reliable diggers. So it was a good mix, and we pretty much used a combination during the rest of our years there from 2000 to 2010. But we still maintained some of those old traditions, mowing the hay there. First time that the hay was documented being put up with a team was 1909, and this is probably about 2009. So about 100 years of haying with teams. Not very many places in Alaska can say that. And it was just a great experience for all those U of I and ISU, sometimes Boise State students that would come in the summer and then really get into it, get kind of competitive too about who can pick up the biggest shock of hay. And we had some, like everything, mentoring, we had to learn too. And we had some pretty good trainers in our early years with haying. An interesting gentleman that came in to paint images of the archaeology project had put up hay in South Africa, and he taught us how to thatch, and he was good at it. And Holly primarily, that became her thing. She was a good thatcher. And maintaining that machinery, my father had put up hay in central Montana in the 20s and 30s, and he came in and understood how all the equipment worked. When we had a breakdown, he was very handy to have. But we really felt it was important, we still feel it's extremely important to maintain a lot of these old traditions, our heritages, and like to have opportunities to pass on those things, whether it's in a formal setting to students, or this is an Idaho Fish and Game officer in the lower left. They all have to be certified now in order to operate stock, and we provided some training opportunities doing that. And it's just all about living history. There's at the same site, 80 years apart, people doing some element of packing mules. That's that forest supervisor Rutledge. I think he's about 7 foot, throwing a dynamite. I think about the biggest horse I've ever seen. Dave Lewis and other smaller gentlemen are watching. But you need to practice, you need to live it in order to be able to teach it. That's pretty much the bottom line. And that place serves as a great environment for that. But you need good examples from the past. This is Cougar Dave Lewis in his later years in Upper Big Creek. His heritage, his legacy is a great example for those of us in more recent times. And we like to pass on whatever we knew to the students, chopping wood, shooting bows, catching whitefish, and we made everything a little lighthearted competition, which was always fun. What was kind of frustrating to me, though, is I would train these students, and they always would seem so awkward at the beginning, and then by the end of the summer, especially in later years, they would always defeat me, even at bow shooting. Really frustrating. But a lot of lasting relationships were formed from that. It was great to be a mentor. Heck, I've got mentors in this room. Mike Schlegel's mentored me in wildlife biology. Bill Fisk was probably the first one to show me how to shoot a recurve bow, and Tom Fisk. Terry Hollyer-Betts. This mentoring theme is extremely important, and I think it's something that is a little bit in peril in our current times. I think it needs to be cultivated and reapplied, whatever the activity. It's just an important part of our heritage. And sometimes we try and pass on maybe a little too much, get these young ladies to act like a gruff mule skinner. One thing that I do miss from our backcountry living experience was the handy hunting opportunities and the opportunity to be self-sufficient. We had a good garden, we had a good orchard. We produced meat for the winter, and we kept our meat in the old way. We didn't have enough freezer space to freeze it, so we would shoot it late and we would hang it, form a rind and keep that way until into the spring, and then what was left we would can usually. So again, living in the old way. And for me, I'm a traditional bow hunter, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how those sheep-eater Indians would have used quite primitive bows and arrows, although they made good ones, and they used sheep horn for the facing of their bows. They made good stuff, but they still have limits. And every time I would bow hunt, there's not one time I went afield and I didn't think about how they would have done their hunting. And it really made it a rich experience. Very reflective and fun, and good memories of that. And this one seems a little out of place to me, but this is our hydroelectric system that we brought electricity to Taylor Ranch when we returned in the late 90s. And we couldn't have had things like those communication devices that you saw in that earlier image without electricity. And we kept batteries charged with it. It really did improve our life, there's no question about it. And made that site an up-to-date facility. There's Janet's broken wrist or something on the computer. But this changed things. And it sounds like, in talking to the folks who are at Taylor now, Taylor Ranch is still running. They still provide a lot of educational opportunities. But one thing they've done that I think is kind of cool is they limit the amount of time you can spend on the computer, which I think is good. Makes you get out and see the countryside. And we had all the latest stuff, DirecTV, communication capabilities through satellite. But despite all this technology, the place is still very wild. And in that sense, it's quite magical. And not just because of all the wild components of the wildlife, but because of this heritage, this human history aspect. And I think that's the thing that really gets overlooked a lot in wilderness, is the fact this is a big enough wilderness to capture a culture. It captures not only a culture that's still operating today, but it captures a relic of the way things used to be, and incredibly important in our heritage. And that's the place. It's quite a special spot. Deeply dissected canyons. Just a great spot. Harsh, hot, very hot in the summer. When we would put up hay, it would usually be over 100 degrees. And then in the winter, and they obviously picked that site for the original settlement during summer months because they didn't pick it in the winter because the sun never hits that place in the winter. But like Holly mentioned with the work with the students, it just really, they were life-altering experiences, and I think they've helped formulate us to be able to do the things that we do now. And one thing that I didn't say at the beginning was what we do now. We live in Northeast Oregon, in Enterprise. Holly's a commissioner in the Fish and Wildlife Commission for the state. She represents Eastern Oregon. And I am a director of the Oregon Hunters Association on conservation issues, which usually means that I have to give presentations and testimony to the commission body, which is a little awkward at times, since she sits on it. But if it's too contentious, I get somebody else to read the testimony. And we miss a lot of the things from the backcountry, but we also apply a lot of the things I feel that we learned through that experience. And it's, that place is really for folks of all ages and experiences. It's just very, very enriching to spend some time back there. In our book, this book here, which we will be selling copies of for $17, the last tab there, it added to a collection of books from the Idaho backcountry. There's actually a fifth one. Besides ours, 7,003 Days, there's another one that Wayne Minshaw did called Cabin Creek Chronicles. So given that specific little site, there's been quite a bit of literature that's been published from there. And I think that's because it's really a unique and special place, and we were really, really lucky to be able to spend our prime years back there. There we are in the younger scene. Yeah, that actually is the preferred way to bring your Christmas tree home, to dragging it. We skidded them for a while with a mule and harness, and you kind of break some branches when you do that. Anyway, that's the end. Any questions?
Question.
Yep.
Being a wilderness area, a lot of times I've seen before when an area became a wilderness, the Forest Service went in and took everything out